はちみつのデバイスからなんですけど、一応ちゃんと自分です。ロールコールをしたいと思います。is OG here?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you.
Here
Okay.
too.
Opening up.
Yeah, we're both here from the same device.
Alright. Closing off.
We hear from same device as well.
Right. And closing up.
I'm here, thank you.
Great. Okay. Is the judges here? I see Yugo-san and Sakino-san and Akari-san and Sakura-san. I think everyone's here and complete. You don't have to send a speaker order, but like, if for those who did, thank you. I can distinguish who's who from your voices anyways. Yeah, just few housekeeping before we move on. First, POI is mandatory, so please take one, and I will highly encourage to offer one. Yeah, and everything else is follows that what we already explained in the briefing. I will force you to take POI if you ignore more than 2. And second, I'm not gonna send a timestamp in the chat, so please time all the speeches by yourself. Yeah, so without much further ado, on the motion that this House believe that Trump escalating tensions with China will do more harm than good for countries around Southeast Asia, I'd like to welcome Prime Minister whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. じゃあ頑張ります。
ちょっと待って、これが見えてない。あ、そっか。
Okay, good morning everyone. First of all, let me briefly set up this debate. How Trump escalation looks like. This looks like, for example, strong tariff on the semiconductor trade, another trade war between China and the United States, and also military tensions like United States are currently doing like training between like South Korea, something like that. Because of these escalations, this will incentivize China to strongly enhance their own military activity or more economic independence as China and more initiative in the Asian country. This will harming those kind of country like Taiwan, Philippines or something like that. Therefore, we propose this motion. Today, we have 2 arguments. The first argument is about the military expansion, including Taiwan invasion. Secondly, about the economic independence of China, which harms other countries. I will explain one by one. First of all, let's talk about military expansion, that is to say, the Taiwan invasion mainly. We say because of Trump escalations, Taiwan invasion are more likely to happen more speedy. I have 4 structural reasons. Firstly, because of these escalations, China has more exclusive incentive to try to enhance their own military activity or their own military resources. Because there are more necessity or likelihood to fight against the United States, for example, even if it is not China, but still a proxy war in the different area, like supporting Venezuela or something like that. In this kind of situations, China see more necessity and more justification to try to increase the resources of military expenditure. In that kind of situation, they have more exclusive reasons to enhance their own strong military or something like that. And also, in order to invade Taiwan or in order to fight against the United States, they need more military power. Therefore, that will be more exclusive reasons for them to enhance these military things. Secondly, because they enhance these military things, this will increase the feasibility or workability of success of invasion of Taiwan. When they have good technology, good have weapon, good army, a good like cyber attack to the United States or something like that, they see more probability of prosperity of military invasion, unification of Taiwan in the name of like China something. In that kind of situation, they can carry out those kind of invasion much more quickly in the decision making processes. Thirdly, like they can try to make control of like semiconductor industry of Taiwan. Taiwan is famous for its like TSMC, and they have good famous popularity in terms of semiconductor control. In this situation, taking initiative as much as possibly try to get good initiative of semiconductor is very important, especially when United States are doing like tariff things on the semiconductor. They have to get their own resources semiconductor control. In this situation, this will incentivize those kind of China to do such kind of things. Fourthly, in terms of macho man things, Trump is so macho man. Xi Jinping want to be more macho man than the Trump. There are some pride of Xi Jinping. They have to take stances that when Trump is doing very macho man things, saying like I have to protect Taiwan or something like that, then if they don't do that, like Xi Jinping looks weaker, then that is so bad for the image of Xi Jinping. Therefore, they have incentive to try to take attitude of strong positive stance about invasions. For four structural reasons, the Taiwan invasion is more early, more speedy, and more likely. Why this is impactful? When invasion happens, people die. Taiwan people or like Japanese people, or maybe the people around there, they die, right? In this situation, this die is very one of the biggest impact in debate. Therefore, this will happen. But I know Judge will say, oh, certainty of Taiwan invasion is less likely, or like this happens anyway, or something like that. Therefore, I have even if cases. Even if invasion doesn't happen, still, strengthening the military things itself will be the harm to those kind of country in the South China Sea or something like that, to some reasons. Firstly, in terms of territorial dispute, like China has more strong initiative to do that because they have now good technology of good military things. Now they have strong stances against the United States or Japan or something like that. In this situation, they have more radical incentive to do that kind of like, for example, sending strong military ship against very territorial dispute island things. And in worst case, they may attack, or like as they did to the Japan, they will like targeting the like ship by the like using laser or something like that. This will just increases the fear or like those kind of threats from the perspective of Philippines or something like that. In this kind of situation, this threat will be the bad for the citizens. They have to be fearful about being attacked by China. Also, they have to use more military money for their own country to protect. This means there are another like budget to use, for example, welfare or education or those kind of things will be decreased. This will strongly affect the country's like management. Therefore, this is so bad for those kind of country in those kind of South China Sea. Therefore, this harm strongly makes sense. Then, secondly, let's talk about economic things, which I am not so good at explaining. We say China have more incentive to seek economic independence and enhance their own initiative in the like Asian countries. I have three structural reasons. Firstly, because of like semiconductor is very important, then the United States try to like restrict such kind of things by the power of tariff. This will incentivize China to make their own original resources, original way to make the semiconductor, because semiconductor is one of the very important things to make weapon or AI technology or something like that. In this situation, they have more exclusive reason to do that when they cannot import it from those kind of United States. Secondly, because they have capacity or capacity to do that, two reasons. Firstly, in terms of human capital, China, there are good educations, then there are good many, but like engineering. In this situation, they have good human capital to try to make that kind of semiconductor in the first place. Secondly, they have technology like nanometer processing technology, which is necessary for making those semiconductor or something like that. Because of these reasons, if they have incentive, they are capable to do such kind of things. Thirdly, because especially when military tension increased, then importance of semiconductor will be skyrocketing in terms of like technology, in terms of AI competition or something like that. For those three reasons, like in terms of econ, because the United States will lose soft power to deter the China's actions, but China enhances prosperity of their soft power within the like Asian countries. Then why this is problematic? First of all, Asian countries have to be dependent on like China's economy. This means China can take advantages in terms of negotiation or something like that. This will be one of the biggest reasons of like debt trap diplomacies, just like happening in the One Belt and Road initiative. They are just taking the port of such kind of like another South China Sea country, something like that. Just like this, when like countries are heavily depending on that China can say that, oh, I will give you this platform, I will give you this semiconductor, but instead there will be some interest or there will be some like trade. But if you cannot breach, if you breach such kind of negotiation, I have to take your port or something like that. Because of this, they are more as expanding power of China. Therefore, they can have more good their own like beneficial trade. This will harm another countries. For those reasons, we are happy to propose. Thank you.
Right. Thank PN for the remark. I'd like to welcome Leader of Opposition whenever you're ready.
名前を出こ
Here you are.
はい、ありがとうございます。Alright, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Not doing anything only exacerbates China aggression. That leads to more shooting to fishing ships in the South China Sea, or that leads to more like laser pointing things. That leads to more exacerbation of China. More than happy to oppose. Several things in my speech. First, response to OG. Secondly, brief setups. Thirdly, is I'm going to talk about China's response, why they are more likely to have less pressure on the South China Sea and Southeast Asia countries on our side of the house. So first of all is response. So they said regarding economic reliance on China, I have two responses. Firstly, that's unlikely to happen to begin with, that China is going to create their semiconductor only inside China. Because, for example, TSMC in Taiwan has patents and has meticulous technology, and creation of semiconductor requires like meticulous technology and very clean rooms and clean like equipment, for example, which is costly for China to develop from the scratch. It is more efficient for them to rely on Taiwan's TSMC to begin with. It's unlikely that the South China Sea countries are suddenly going to rely heavily on China. Second response, even if that's not true, they are already economically reliant on China because they are the closest economic hub. They are importing natural resources, and they are importing a lot of food or all those semiconductor included, those kind of things, which means that the economic reliance is probably largely symmetric in this debate. Getting on to the setup, right? So let's just illustrate what kind of actions Americans are going to do on our side of the house. The America is probably going to send larger ships to deter China troops from being present in the South China Sea, or even like US is going to send their own troops to be present there, or they are going to impose tariff as Prime Minister considered, or they may be going to like create artificial island, as in they are currently doing for Philippines under the status quo. They're helping the Philippines to create artificial island to expand their EEZ, for example. Those kind of things. The reason why this is likely to lead to China less aggression is because of 4 reasons, and this pushes back the opening government's preemption. So first reason why is that this is likely to become really, really serious threat for China, right? So America is willing and capable of imposing massive pressure and taking out the foreign leaders, as for example, we see this example in Venezuela. It was true in Venezuela, it was true in Iran, it was true in like Congo, for example, right? So this risk of retaliation, risk of threat coming from the US is a really serious issue for Xi Jinping, right? In case of Venezuela, US was able to take out Maduro in 5 minutes. They did gather information from CIA. They were able to take out the leader that easily, and that means Xi Jinping has to be very risk averse in terms of that. They said that they have to care about, Xi Jinping has to care about strongman narrative, and that's the reason why they are going to rather retaliate. I have 2 reasons why risk is more important than strongman narrative. The first reason why is that strongman narrative is probably not that necessary for him to stay in power under the status quo. Already he has removed opposition. Already he has removed other superpowers within the CCP, which means that he doesn't really have to stick to the strongman narrative to stay in power. What he does care, what he needs to care, is the real risk coming from the US, which means they are more likely to go on to diplomatic table on our side of the house. Second reason is that the retaliation and losing to the battle eventually leads to destroying leads to like weaker pride, weaker man image. Rather, that means this is because U.S. troops are probably stronger than China's troops, which means that sending some portion of troops in South China Sea and faces the American troops and losing in the battle means that the Xi Jinping looks way weaker, which means not doing anything is way better in terms of China's calculus. That reason why is that he wants to maintain military for Taiwan, which is the exact reason why he probably doesn't want to send troops to South China Sea, for example, Philippines, for example, Malaysia, or Singapore on our side of the house. But lastly is economic harm, right? China is probably going to face massive economic harm, no thank you, if US is going to send troops or is going to impose massive tariffs on China. For example, sanction against semiconductor imports, as Prime Minister has said, their preemption was to say that they have to seize TSMC semiconductor on their side of house. China has, on our side of house, China is going to retaliate to take Taiwan on their side, on our side of house, or whatnot. No, invasion of China leads to rather worse economic consequences, because invading means that you are going to destroy supply chains. This is also going to fear out the semiconductor industries in Taiwan, which means they are less willing to import goods to China, and this is also going to invade trading routes between Taiwan and like Philippines, for example, which means that the transporting cost is going to be way more expensive. China doesn't want to do that because they do not want semiconductor to be very expensive. What this suggests is that this is going to lead to rather diplomatic negotiation on our side of house rather than aggression. What is the impact of that? There are twofold. First of all is that at least threatening towards island people in South China Sea and fishing ships is likely to decrease because they fear US intervention and they fear economic harms I've explained, which means that there'll be less shooting, there'll be less death of innocent people on the ground. I think this is way more important impact in this debate. Before moving on, closing or if not opening.
Closing あります?
Opening.
Okay. Your risk argument is premised upon the fact the United States is so strong, but I don't think so, because China is already strong because of my explanation. And geographically, it's very easier for the China to deploy and prepare for the invasion of South China Sea something.
Yeah.
The United States is very far.
That's true, but that doesn't mean they cannot send troops, right? Also, US is way stronger because, precisely I've explained, they had the capacity to topple the foreign leader in Venezuela, for instance, right? So Xi Jinping has to be risk averse, is the point. What is the second impact then, right? Resource extraction is going to be way easier on our side of the house for Philippines, for Malaysia, for example, because on their side of the house, China is going to intervene. China is going to increase the cost of resource extraction, which means that the cost of living for general people on the ground is going to increase because oil or natural gas, for example, is going to be used everywhere, and difficulty of extracting that means that there's going to be massive cost of daily goods, which means on our side of the house, people will be saved on the ground. Even if you do not buy any of that, notably, opening up was uncompetitive. On their side of the house, China has freedom to do whatever they want. They can intervene, they can sanction South China Sea countries, they can sanction Vietnamese, they can intervene in those countries, which means that we have the methods to solve that. OG has none opposed.
はい、聞こえますか？はい。POI は、主にクロージングから取ります。坂から取ります。I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things from Deputy Prime Ministers. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the deterrence effect coming from the opening oppositions, whether or not the United States pressure can be the deterrence or rather to escalate the tension between China and US or the China and Southeast Sea. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the main enhancing the issues about semiconductor industry or the economic the relationship between the China and other countries, which is particularly unique to the current the economic status or the current the geopolitical status in the first place. So let's talk about the deterrence effect coming from their side of the house. Their argument is as follows: because China fear the United States pressure, so CCP do nothing in order to protect their reputations. We think this is false assumption. Several false assumptions exist in this argument because firstly, that they assume that the power asymmetry between China and the United States. Firstly, currently the Chinese the military are currently massively strong because of the current policies and escalated bit after the Trump administration is second Trump administration is achieved. We think the power of the number of nuclear weapons is increasing, whether the enhancement of the cyber military exists or enhancement of space military exists, which is particularly important for the current modern war society. We think in this particular occasion that China have some capacity to fight against the United States. Unlike the Venezuelan situations, we think this is unique situation in the first place. And more than that, we say, as my partner mentioned, that the geographic difference exists because we think that in order for the United States to the attack against the China, in this occasion they have to utilize the Southeast Seas military bases. But in order for this is the weak point of the United States. That's why China tried to pressurize the Southeast Sea countries in the first places. That's why the China have the feasibility in terms of the counter to the United States assumption in the first places. We think more than that, we say their argument about fear of Venezuelan incident is rather our argument because we think that they fear that this kind of decapitation attack to decapitation strike towards the CCP's the leaders of CCP. We think in this occasion, in order to avoid that, they try to maximize their enhancement of cyber security, like for example the enhancement of the missile security in the first places, because the Venezuelan problem is that they utilize the Russian missile protection system, which is countered by the invalidated by the United States recent military system. That's why they have the more incentive in order to avoid this kind of incident. They have the motivation to enhancement on the military in the first places. We think that this kind of reputation of the CCP is problematic because we think the current populational disadvantage exists in the Chinese economy because Chinese economy is ended the population bonus because currently declining of the population and the elderization of the population is happening. We think in this occasion the natural deflation economy is current situation of the China, which means that the deflation of the economy or the declining of the economy is particularly problematic for the reputation of the CCP. In this occasion, in order for survive the CCP's the governance for those governance, they need the military or the geopolitical presence is necessary for the CCP. That's why we say if the United States try to prevent this kind of geopolitical presence, in this occasion they have to maximize the military power and military pressure for the other country in the first places. That's why we think our argument about deterrence is rather counterproductive because we think that even as my partner mentioned that even if the actual intervention is not happening in the few features. We think the strength of the military itself is particularly harmful because we think the military the political pressure to the Southeast Sea country that deprive the solvency of the other Southeast Sea country because they have to follow in order for the fear of this kind of the Chinese military powers. They fear they cannot do what they want to do and they have to follow the Chinese government Chinese government orders. We think this situation is particularly harmful. And more than that, we say that Taiwan invasion is not the fictional scenario. We think that's a realistic scenario for even for the analyst of the United States or even for the analyst of all over the country. We think this kind of possibility of decreasing the possibility of the Taiwan intervention is first priority for the current Southeast Seas government benefit. We think that's why we think that the pressurizing the Chinese people, Chinese government is particularly harmful for the perspective of the China. So that's why we say this is not this is our case. So I take 草加がいいけど草加はない。はい、どうぞ。
Okay, so Southeast Asia countries have to spend massive resources on their military because China has freedom to do whatever they want, including intervention. What is the delta that you can create?
We think that we don't understand why the Southeast Asia countries because our logic is simple. Because United States pressurized that China counter that for those that Southeast country have to maximize military and they have to follow the Chinese order. We think this is problematic. So that's simple scenario. So let's talk about semiconductor industry in our scenarios. We think they mentioned that China can have unable to do so. We think that before the Trump scenario, Trump restriction on the semiconductor is market incentive is problematic because Chinese government have the motivation to maximize their own semiconductor industry, but the researchers or the makers need the NVIDIA GPUs. NVIDIA GPU have the unique method in order to train the generative AI. In this scenario, that the market incentive is, even though the Chinese government try to grow their own semiconductor industry, market do not follow these situations. But if that as a result of Trump restrict this kind of the restriction of the exportation of the NVIDIA GPU, in this occasion, that the market have to follow this kind of government incentive to that government incentive of the growing the semiconductor industry. We think the result of the simple, because the economic dependency between in terms of semiconductor industry or the other high-tech industry is particularly important for the peace of the both country, because the economic dependency are factually the important for the not doing war, because the risk calculus is different from the dependency and the independence of the economic situation. That's why we see this kind of the Trump the tariff problem or the restriction of the exporting problem is also damaging to the security of the Southeast Asia. That's why we are very proud to propose.
All right. Just a second. I'll take POIs from closing preferably, but I'd like my POIs in the chat. That's it. Okay. Time will start in 3, 2, 1. There'll be 3 things in my speech. The first 2 will be taking out OG's path to victory. The first about Taiwan invasion, and the second about talking about how this decreases US soft power and why China is going to decouple from semiconductors. The last thing I'm going to talk about is finally pushing our pathway to victory, which is that we're able to provide a stable economic source for farmers, for fishers, for people who are extracting resources, which are obviously far more proximate and more direct and more certain of an impact in this round. The first thing I'll do then is quickly engage with what OG gives us. The first thing OG tries to push their case on is to talk about why the Taiwan invasion is far more likely to happen. We would first just like to note the fact that obviously this is more of an ideological battle that China sees. Like, China doesn't see the Taiwan thing to be one of like, oh, we have more military capacity, now we can just capture Taiwan. Obviously this is far more nuanced. It's more reflective of how nationalists think about these kinds of things. It's more about how China sees their own country in a more ideological sense, which obviously means the OG only explaining why there's increased capacity through things like more budgets because there's been a rise in international tensions, for example, is not sufficient to prove that this is the incentive analysis that becomes the tipping point for China to invade into Taiwan. See, this is highly speculative, but more importantly, obviously Taiwan and China has far stronger incentives to opt into and invade Taiwan if necessary. Things like semiconductors are far more proximate and are going to be more like, it's more exogenous factors that aren't really related to whether or not Trump pushes pressures onto South China Sea, right? So I just don't think there's a margin in this debate. I don't this is really relevant to begin with. Moving on, they talk about why they're likely to decouple from the US in terms of the semiconductor. The first thing I would just like to note here is, again, that obviously this debate is not just about Taiwan, right? Like, fine, maybe it might be semiconductors, but if Trump finds this to be like a bad strategy, obviously he can use far more different strategies like the ones we talked about, just basic kinds of sanctions, basic kinds of military interventions, for example, to target things like artificial islands that China's trying to build, for example. So I just don't think this is likely to be the relevant kind of outcome that's like most certain that OG can really base their case on. But second of all, we would also know the fact that, again, this is quite irrelevant come from OG, right? Because obviously this is going to be a long-term shift that's motivated by many other factors rather than just Trump trying to enforce things like tariffs. So things like semiconductors are going to be done anyways. We don't think it has to come through Trump actually intervening in the South China Sea. I think there are many other, strategic reasons for China to try to decouple from from the semiconductor industry. I'm not exactly sure why this is quite exclusive to this debate. The second thing I would like to note here is to weigh this argument, because I just don't think that OG is able to explain why this kind of decrease in soft power or China decoupling from semiconductors is massively problematic, because they hint at words like soft power, but we're really unclear to how much extent that hurts US. We presumably say that US already has things like sent in a lot of militaries and troops into the Southeast Asia, South China Sea, Taiwan. So obviously a lot of these countries are very, very strongly connected to the US. Obviously they don't always just take ties with China, but nevertheless, they never actually explain how this decrease in soft power is going to actually impact this in a negative way on our side of the house. Obviously there is no clear pathway to victory from OG. The next thing I want to talk about is, far more importantly, pushing our impacts about why Chinese retaliation, at least slowing down, is going to help a lot of people on the ground, and why this is far more important of an impact. The first thing I want to do here is be very clear about why China is likely to back down. But first of all, I want to be very clear about what kinds of backing down this is even about, because I think OG maybe closing half is going to misunderstand our case. Our case was not that China is going to completely stop doing things. Our case was not that China is going to suddenly become a good boy and completely forget about South China Sea. That is not the case that we're reliant on. What we told you is rather that China will not necessarily completely move out, but rather they're going to do things like slow down the process of bulldozing over the South China Sea. They're going to do things like less building, or slow down the building of artificial islands. They're more happy to do things like stop using ideological, or even on their side of the house, they might do things like add pressure by adding an ideological sense to this battle, whereas right now on our side of the house, the South China Sea is just less relevant of an issue or topic as compared to things like Taiwan. So it's just far less likely for things to escalate, likely for China to try to capitalize on this kind of issue for them on an ideological sense. So we just don't think these are kinds of things that are likely to happen. What's likely to happen is that things slow down, things become more peaceful, and to that extent, we're able to get things like negotiations, we're able to have things like deals and treaties, which allows things like future justification for things like sanctions, backlash, trials. It also means that Southeast Asia and South China Sea countries are actually able to raise their voices about how their farmers, fishermen, and resource extractors need a lot of money, for example. And for example, it means that you're able to have discussions within ASEAN about how you want to control these kinds of situations and actually get their voices. Before I move on to the mechanism clash, CG, OG then.
Factually, during second Trump administration, the number of sea territory incident is increasing and media report on Taiwan problem is increasing. Why do you think there is no causal link between these actions and Trump administrations?
Okay, maybe that's factually true, but you've never explained why that's directly related to Trump escalating tensions. I haven't heard that Trump is escalating South China Sea anyways. Rather, it proves to you that currently China has their own incentives to try to invade into South China Sea, because of the fact that they think they can bulldoze over countries like Philippines because they're powerless. When US enters, the power dynamics completely shifts. So why will China actually back down? I'll actually engage with what OG gives us here. The first thing is, we already explained to you that things like financial actually quite powerful. And they say that, you're able to have a bigger military budget, but obviously this is not justified when you use it on things like South China Sea, where people don't really understand the importance of it. Obviously, these are things used for Taiwan. Even people within the CCP, the nationalist people, are probably going to oppose these kinds of decisions to use more money on Taiwan, on South China Sea, even given that this is not the highest agenda within their incentives. So I just don't think this is quite likely. The second thing we would also note the fact is that obviously they want to, even if they have a lot of military resources, doesn't mean they can use it wastefully, right? They have a lot of issues right now with Indian borders. They care a lot about Taiwan. Obviously, these are far higher priorities. Obviously, this is the way in which they want to save up their military, especially given the fact that they really care about Taiwan becoming a massive issue, becoming a very proximate issue for them right now, meaning they might need the military anyways. The third thing I want to be very clear about is that actually, right, we think that it's very easy for China to just like back off or to act like at least slow down the building up and tensions of the South China Sea. And the reason why is because of the fact that obviously this is not as politicized of a topic as compared to things like Taiwan, in which case they have no option to opt out. But currently in the calculus of China, obviously this is not that big of a concern because it's not media, it's not politicized, it's not brought up by media internationally, for example. So people don't really know about these kinds of issues. It doesn't hurt the reputation or it doesn't hurt the financial capacity of China to just back off right now and to maintain some levels of islands, for example. I just don't think China really needs to actually go into active war in this kind of situation. So we do think this is the quite likely situation. But even if that's not the case, we would say that at least on our side of the house, we're able to prevent China from bulldozing over the South China Sea. We're able to prevent this kind of thing happening that happens on Gov, where China is not scared of all these. For those reasons, we're able to prevent economic losses.
Hello, my name is Nari and I would like to take POIs, preferably from opening, and if not, closing. My speech will start in 3, 2. First of all, responses to OO, and second of all, moving on to extension, specifically extending on the second part that from OG about trade war and stuff. First of all, about refutations. They first of all talked about how they are probably going to have less retaliations and more spaces for negotiation, specifically about China. But we say this is unlikely to be the case because A, they talked about ideological things does not necessarily, and conflict does not necessarily happen. But we do not believe in that case when China specifically depends on global confidence regarding the fame, not only limited to Asian countries, but also regarding Africa, where they give these countries with loans, so that these sort of like military confidence and that sort of like showing powers to other countries as well is going to be a tipping point for these China to have a massive incentive to invest into these. Instead of like negotiating, they're probably going to take more risks over specific benefit that they enjoy in the current life. But second of all is regarding the sunk cost. I think many companies in Southeast Asia states, there are like companies from Chinese bases. For example, like there are many semiconductor companies and stuff. I think these companies probably lobby against the Chinese government or probably have negotiation and give favor to these governments. For example, like MNEs and insurance companies probably ask the Chinese government to have more military power and give more confidence to the market in order to make sure that China can make a stable economic growth and stuff. So next, I would like to move on to my extension, how the trade war actually accelerates on outside house and impact following. So there are several mechanisms as to how this trade war actually looks like. First of all, it's regarding higher tariff and higher taxation on the imports, probably leading to less quality of people's lives. This exactly looks like how they raise the raw cost of products in Southeast Asia. For example, like production of raw foods, but also raw clothes and stuff. They are significantly dependent on China in terms of clothes and semiconductor. But also at the same time, these Southeast Asian countries depend on America as well regarding car manufacturing of foods and ITs and many other industries. So regardless of how likely US or China is going to take control over Southeast Asia, they'll probably get affected regardless of the consequence of how battle is going to happen or how negotiation is going to happen. That sort of like tariff increasing tension is probably going to happen. This causes companies to be less capable to export to Southeast Asian countries. For example, like US and China will strengthen trade they'll be less capable to export to Southeast Asian countries, and we say this is bad when companies are no longer able to extract benefit from these areas. They probably find another route, for example, like markets in South America or in Africa and stuff, or Middle East or stuff. That's sort of like the comparative leverage that Southeast Asia has as a market. We're probably going to gradually decrease through these increasing raw cost in products and stuff. The second mechanism is how military tension leads to market instability and unpredictability from several perspectives. A is regarding the trade routes. For example, like with higher tension around a specific island or specific territory, there'll be a gradual increase in anxiety among the investors or the company which engages in these trades and stuff. There'll be a massive increase in military power as we do concede to the opening half. For example, with higher tension around Taiwan, Japan oftentimes seeks another import route instead of the direct route which goes just next to Taiwan. They probably go to a far further route and take more cost in transportation fees and stuff like that. This also affects the goods prices as well. But mechanism B is how investment chilling effect is probably going to happen. When Trump made an announcement on increasing tariff and China retaliating on that tariff war, their stock prices in US and China plummeted. There are some like opt-outs of companies from Taiwan regarding opt-outs of the company from Taiwan regarding US-owned companies, and therefore that sort of like investment chilling effect is probably going to happen on our house. Why we say this is important in this debate? That first of all, this affects livelihood on the ground. This is not only about people having anxiety towards the militaries, but also about the 10,000 yen increase in goods prices significantly affect people's annual livelihood, but also regarding the blue collar workers who significantly depend on employment made by MNEs and stuff. We say these sort of things will probably going to affect more people on the ground compared to how like OO or OG extended upon how people are going to have there will be more like military tension and stuff. The second thing to note here is that we say this impact outweighs what the impact coming from OG. They talked about how probably more people going to die from wars and stuff, and also increasing tension leads to more investment into military and stuff. But we say our side is more important when the national expenses significantly depends on how they form these markets inside that particular area. For example, like Myanmar significantly depends on agriculture, but also Thailand significantly depends on car industries and stuff. So given that context, we think higher dependence on US or either China is going to be significantly negatively affecting these individuals. But also, regardless of how like price is going to increase or decrease or not, having the like necessity to take a clear stance which to follow US or China in itself is going to be negative when they have to significantly depend on a particular country. Thereby, there will be a significant increase in risk when there's a natural disaster or significant like political conflict that happen within that particular country, and thereby there will be a less and less amount of like leverage that each particular company have in a ASEAN community as well. So for all of these reasons, we propose. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Okay, as MO, gender pronunciation, please. If you have any POI, please text in the chat box. I already opened the chat box. I prefer opening POI. I'm going to start my speech within 3, 2, 1, go ahead. I think in the opening half and in this debate, the Taiwan invasion is the most important issue because compared with, for example, the military provoked issue such as razor issue, etc., I think in terms of gravity on the impact, it's so huge. The number of the people who were involved and damage on those kind of citizens extremely huge. Therefore, we think this is the most important issue. And on this issue, for example, opening half talked about power of military, China or US, which is more stronger, or for example, intention of Xi Jinping, how the motivation will change, etc. But I think this kind of issue is not so important. Why? Because in case of, for example, power of military, it is difficult to compare which is more stronger. For example, in terms of the China, actually, the country has a strong, tremendous amount of the population and soldiers number itself, and have a massive amount of the weapons, for example, aircraft ship, etc. But in case of the United States of America, actually, even though in terms of the number, they are smaller than the China, they are well trained, and they have the practical experience. They actually experience the war for many years, for example, Iraq or Afghan, Venezuela. From this kind of perspective, which is more stronger, it is very difficult for us to judge. Or, for example, in case of the intention of the Xi Jinping, actually the Xi Jinping's intention is extremely concrete from the past, right? Strong wish to, for example, unite those kind of Taiwan. Therefore, this kind of issue is not so important. Most important issue in this debate is that in which paradigm we can economically weaker China. This is crucially important in order to avoid and minimize the risk of invasion. That's why I'm going to talk about this issue as an extension. So first, let's talk about the extension. Is that how those kind of the Trump's escalation can make the very influential MNCs which contribute to Chinese economy start to withdraw from China and shift to other countries. We think this is crucially important in order to minimize the power of China. First, let's talk about importance. We think, actually, what we have to recognize here is that in order to carry out military action from the perspective of China, actually, for example, using the air fighter or send ground troops, or for example, use aircraft carrier, actually, every single action need massive amounts of money. They have to pay the salary to tremendous amounts of soldiers. They have to use the oil, or they have to create a missile, etc. Which means that economically weaker means it can structurally deprive the military power to begin with, especially in the recent context of China. For example, internal poverty are expanding, and the citizens' complaint are maximized. In this occasion, as for Chinese government, it is extremely high risk to use up budget only for military action. Therefore, in order to avoid nations' riot or rebellion to begin with, therefore we think make China economically weak is extremely important in order to stop and minimize the risk of Chinese invasion. How on our side of research, which means that how Trump's escalating tension can make those kind of situation. I'm going to talk about this logic from now on. What we have to recognize here is that for those kind of, for example, MNCs CEO, or for example, those kind of the top of MNCs have to fear the risk of those kind of war to begin with. Especially once war start, actually it's structurally damage to MNC's factory or, for example, branch in China. Why is that? Because actually, the mainland of China, if mainland of China is attacked, for example, US Army and the Chinese Army fight, for example, aggressively each other on the ground of China, actually the many places, many areas will be the warfare, not only the, for example, military, but also surrounding area, including the factory or branches, can also be involved. In worst case, those kind of facilities are broken. Secondly, more important, even if mainland is not attacked, which means, for example, battle can happen on the sea, on the South China Sea, etc., still it's damage to the MNCs. Why is that? Because once war happens, Chinese government try to maximize the internal resources for the war, which means that, for example, they start to force salary workers to work in the military factories. In this occasion, MNC's factories are deprived of their human resources, or, for example, they try to, Chinese government start to increase more taxation on MNC's later, please, in order to get the military budget. Or in worst cases, under the name of emergency response, these kind of Chinese governments start to forcibly deprive those kind of factory itself, and in order to use these kind of, for example, facilities, machine to make, for example, military items or so forces, right? From these reasons, why for those kind of MNCs actually escalating tension and risk of risk of Chinese risk of Chinese concerning the risk of battle of China and US, those kind of MNCs, for those kind of MNCs, it is more available choices to withdraw from the China and go to other countries. What we have to recognize here in the recent, realistic example is, for example, Japanese company which is called Toshiba already withdraw from the China and come back to Japan, or in case of the Apple already shifted its own factory to Vietnam, or Samsung already shifted the factory into India, or so forth. This kind of stream is already cultivated. It's a very realistic scenario to begin with. This is crucially important because not as an extension, but as a also counter argument to the CZ's extension. This is important because CZ talked about how surrounding country economically works, but no, we don't believe so, because rather surrounding countries can get more MNC's factory because this kind of country withdraw from the China. That's why this is crucially important even to the CZ. Opening those.
Your extension admit to likelihood of emergency more in the OG. This means our strong impact about invasions or those military strong power of China makes sense. So our impact is larger than yours.
No. I'm talking about the impact of that kind of invasion itself strong. I already admitted, but in order to really carry out those kind of invasion, actually Chinese government cannot. On our side with Chinese government, feasibly it is difficult because economically it's so unrealistic. This is our extension. Moving on to the last issue, our second extension. Even if invasion happens, still we think our side is better. Why? Because on our side, this has escalating tension happen, which means that the surrounding country and Taiwan itself can prepare for through this kind of escalating. Because escalating tension means that other countries can recognize that near future war can happen, conflict can happen, or so forth. Therefore, preparation time can be given. For example, from the viewpoint of Taiwan, how to defend own country or how to cooperate with US military, those kind of negotiation can be done. Or even case of other countries, for example, they can attempt and make plan how to support Taiwan. For example, sending the community, give missile or air fighters, especially Southeast Asian countries have a strong motivation to do so. Because once Taiwan will fall, maybe your country will be the next target because China can get successful achievement. That's why I strongly beg to oppose. Thank you.
Yamato. Thank you. If you have any POI, please result. I never check my chat. And any general pronounce is okay. Okay. I'd like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Our stance is, let's get along with both country and get maximum profit as like Southeast Asia country, like around the South China Sea. And in the status quo that is realized, like in the terms of the trade, like the trade have occurred with both countries, as my person clearly said, and also like in their like military or territory resources, so on. Like even China is close to that countries. Like that country is like get along with like in some part of the military with like US in order to like protect their own territory from the China. So like but like after taking like in the opposition paradigm, like as my person clearly told you, like as that kind of country like around the South China Sea, they have to choose which side they will like support, like China or US. So like they have to like lose their own some profit in some terms. So we're proud to propose this motion. So and then let me compare with each teams. Firstly, like all says like US will keep the peace because they are strong or so on. But firstly, that likelihood is not proven. Like the like power balance or so on is not like it's so washed in the opening half or like the end of this debate. And also like the other argument from all like there is less economic loss, even the war occurs, and so on, is not positively benefitable for that kinds of South China Sea country. And also, like, if war occur, like, clearly damaged to that country, at least, like, in the end of the opening half. So like they OO couldn't prove that like it's like uniquely like having the like some benefit to like that countries around the South China Sea because of this tension, like increasing tension. But on the other hand, like my person clearly told you, like because of this tension, like there are like some economy inside the like South that countries around the South China Sea will like worsen, like because of higher prices or less employment or so on. And so like as a terms of the contribution to like a unique contribution to this round, we override all. And next, secondly, like let me move on to CO. CO said like about the economy, and like if there is some kind of war near that like country around the South China Sea, that some kinds of demand about that war will occur, and like because of that, like that country around South China Sea will likely to like having some kinds of profits by manufacturing and so on. But we think firstly it's so unlikely to occur because like war on each territory, like it means like war on the China, war on the US is so unlikely to happen because like commander of each in each country will likely to avoid it because they will care about the citizens because like citizen is a like so basic condition to support that state itself. So like they have incentive to care about the citizens or citizen life or citizen feelings. But like war on each territory or like war like is occur so close to each territory is like likely to harm their own citizens directly, like their like no fishing activity and like action activity or so on, and it will harm their own like citizen daily lives. So like it's so unlikely to occur, and what kinds of war or what kind of conflict will likely to occur is like around that like each territory. It means like they're including the Southeast Asia countries or so on is so likely to happen. Okay, take.
Yeah, so trade in US and China is irrelevant to Southeast Asia country. They'll trade with China within ASEAN, with the US anyway. What is the harm you're talking about?
Okay. Okay. We think like the firstly, I'm talking about like the as a premise, like every like country in that area having their like connection with both country in the status quo, right? So like it means like the and also like both country like China and the US are so big states, right? So it's like the amount, like rates of the trade in each industry will so huge amount. So like the こうてか simply losing their opponents to having their trade and losing their profit itself will likely to harm that citizen, right? Anyway, so the just beside to the war is so unlikely to happen, and also even that cases CEOs talked about is occur, we think that is will be short term benefit, not so long term. That's all. Thank you.
Can you hear me? 聞こえますか？yes. Okay, I'm opposition whip, same Mizuki Kusaka, gender pronunciation, please. If you have any POI, please do not vocalize and please text in the chat box. I always see the chat box. I'm going to start my speech within 3, 2, 1. Go ahead. What closing opposition do in this debate is extremely important. The first contribution is simply clarifying what's the most important issue in this debate. Second, concerning the first contribution, what's the most realistic scenario in order to minimize the risk of Taiwan invasion? We told you. From this point of perspective, I think the closing opposition should take the first places. I'm going to talk about the detail in my speeches. So first, let's talk about the first contribution, clarifying what's the most important issue. The issue in this debate was that, for example, that a Taiwan invasion can happen, or for example, micro conflict such as laser problem on Japan, or fishing boat banned incidents, like in the case of the Philippines. Or for example, Korean government talk about economy of Southeast Asian countries will be worse, a lot of blue collar workers will lose the job, it's so serious, etc. But even though we take this kind of scenario, still I think the Taiwan invasion should be the top priority issue. Why? Because in case of, for example, micro conflict, maybe, for example, some people are arrested without reasonable reasons, or for example, verbally, boss, for example, the government provoke each other, you are wrong, etc. On the contrary, in case of the invasion, for example, bomb fighter attack mainland of Taiwan. For example, ground troops kill citizens in order to occupy the cities. Concerning these kind of the gravity of impact, we think simply the Taiwan invasion is the most fearful issue. Therefore, it is remarkably that kind of issue should be prioritized. Second, in case of, for example, economy of Southeast Asian countries will be worse, Korean government told you. For example, because international market try to avoid the Asian area itself. As I told you, we already flipped this argument in my extension. Those kind of country recognize, those kind of MNCs, the international market recognize China itself is a very risky places. Therefore, they have a strong incentive to avoid China, not the Asian countries. Therefore, they have a strong incentive to shift from China to other Asian countries. The reason is extremely simple. Compared with the Western society, actually, for the other Asian countries, for example, labor prices are still cheaper than, for example, UK or, for example, France or, for example, United States of America, etc. Therefore, they have a strong incentive to shift to other Asian countries. Moreover, for those kind of other Asian countries like the Vietnam or Philippines, etc. In these kind of Asian countries, there are already the MNCs, which means that for the newly coming MNCs, the settling in this kind of area is much easier compared with going to African countries or, for example, Arab states, etc. Therefore, we think rather those kind of surrounding countries can get the benefit and can get the employment. This is a flip to their argument. Even though judges do not buy this flip, we think still the closing government argument does not make the priority, should not be prioritized. Why? Because once Taiwan invasion happened on our side of this house, simply those Asian countries will be involved, unfortunately, because as I told you, once Taiwan fall, your country can be the next target because the Chinese government cultivates successful achievement. In order to get the benefit, we can invade other countries and we defeat United States of America, etc. Therefore, in this occasion, anyway, if these kind of scenario can happen, international market have a strong motivation to avoid Asian countries entirely if those kind of Taiwan invasion really happen. That's why, anyway, the Taiwan invasion should be the top priority. Concerning this first contribution, what's the most important? Why this is very important is that because this debate should be judged from the perspective of neutral observer. So therefore, for the neutral observer, what's the most important point to issue? Clarifying and present that kind of the priority is very important contribution. Having shown that moving as a second contribution, that シュンヤどうぞ。シュンヤ、いいよ。
Thank you. When domestic economy is not good, there are more incentive to take risk, as we already told you. If my logic about MNC retreat is true, they retreat also from Taiwan because it's very dangerous emergency, Thailand, Philippines. That is directly harming economy.
We told you, firstly, economy, as for your first argument, as I told you, even though the Xi Jinping has a more motivation, they are more eager to invade the Taiwan. Actually, they have the less capacity. We are talking about the capacity to begin with. I will talk about the detail in my second contribution. But secondly, more important, even though it will be damage to the Taiwan's economy, if invasion happen, it will be damaged as more because not only the economical damage, but also citizens' life are endangered. This is why we think our second contribution is more important. Moving on to the second contribution. We structurally told you in order to carry out the military action, especially the Taiwan invasion, what kind of action is necessary? For example, sending ground troops, or for example, using massive amount of missiles, for example, using aircraft carrier or so forth. These kind of every single action needs a massive amount of the money. We already told you, for example, oil or human resources, or for example, maintaining cost or so forth, right? As for China, if economically weaken compared with from now on, actually it is very difficult for Chinese government to carry out Taiwan invasion to begin with, because we already contextualized recently in the domestically those kind of Chinese economy is not so good as foreign government admitted, which means that for example nations complaint are already becomes bigger or so forth. Therefore, Chinese government have to give more food or for example welfare urgently. But if in this occasion Chinese government try to use money for those kind of military action and do not use money for their own its citizens, actually citizens have massive amounts of complaint. And in worst cases, that kind of, for example, more kind of, for example, riot or rebellion can happen domestically. If Chinese government already starts the Taiwan invasion and domestically this kind of issue happen, actually Xi Jinping have to fear that kind of government can be defeated or so forth. Therefore, Chinese government and Xi Jinping have to if economically weakened situation happen, it is structurally difficult for those kind of Chinese government to conduct Taiwan invasion. And we told you how the military escalating tension can lead to the situation and incentivize MNCs to withdraw from China, especially. This is why I'm happy to oppose this motion. Thank you. はい、ありがとうございます。